Greetings, sisters and brothers, and welcome again to Type Productions. I am your host, Talib Muhammad, and thank you for coming back to our channel. With the 2024 presidential election approaching, we at Type Productions have elected to delve into some of the history of the voting preferences of African Americans in the United States. Considering this take it or leave it duo the two major political parties have subjected the American people to in the current election process, an inquisitive mind may be curious as to what has effectuated the current racially aligned political construct. Why is it that for several decades, over 85% of all African Americans have supported the Democratic Party, whereas 85% of the Republican Party finds its support in Caucasian voter turnout? How is it that the party of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who is credited with ending slavery, finds such little support currently in the black community, while the historical advocates of slavery, Jim Crow, and racial segregation, the Democratic Party, is supported by black people in nearly every election for more than a century? Once again, sisters and brothers, as is the method we at Type Production use to analyze any subject matter, we must go back into the history of the subject before we can move forward in developing a comprehensive understanding of said subject. In doing so, we can attain some clarification as to what precipitated this shift in political allegiance and how it may have contributed to the collective disenfranchisement of African Americans in the country. This video will be the first of a three-part series entitled The Black Vote. How do we get here? So let's get to work, sisters and brothers. Here on Each One, Teach Two. In initiating our examination into aspects of the voting history of the United States of America, we begin in 1776 and the Declaration of Independence, which states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, all of us who are educated in the United States public school systems have heard this before. And please note that the grandiose wording of this declaration was dripping with hypocrisy, as its primary author, Thomas Jefferson, held over 600 slaves during his lifetime. Additionally, this Declaration of Independence did not include any women, black or white or otherwise, in its pronouncements of rights, liberty, and happiness. Also excluded were all Native Americans, as they too were not eligible for these rights, as such rights were exclusively granted to Caucasian men, especially Caucasian landowners. Following the Declaration of Independence was the lesser known Articles of Confederation a year later. These articles would serve as the laws of the land in the United States until 1787, when the Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for the purpose of revising those articles and replacing them with the newly crafted Constitution of the United States of America. And it would be during this convention that the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise would be drafted. This Three-Fifths Compromise was an agreement made between the advocates of slavery, who sought to maintain and expand upon the practice of human enslavement, and those who were opposed to its expansion. Whereas slavery did exist in northern states, it was far more prevalent in the South, where agriculture served as the primary source of revenue, with free labor being a means to maximize profits. Correspondingly, many Northerners held similar deep prejudice against African Americans and feared that freed black people would migrate north and undercut Caucasian job opportunities and wages. It was this fear and not humanitarian or Christian values that served as one of the primary factors for the political debates regarding slavery between slave and non-slave states. In an attempt to secure more seats in the House of Representatives, slave states sought to combine the enslaved population with the population of Caucasian citizens in their respective states. This inclusion would result in the increasing of the overall population of the state and thus grant slave states additional seats in the House, and more seats would result in more influence on government policies and more electoral votes in presidential elections. The brazen hypocrisy of this mindset is unmistakable when recognizing that these same enslavers considered African Americans, who they now wanted to count as citizens, to be their personal property, no different than a cow or a horse. The motivation of this duplicitous mindset was founded in the Southern's desire to bolster their state population and increase their political power and influence. Now, the aspirations of politicians from the so-called free states who sought to squash this scheme of including what was considered property into the slave state's population were not motivated by any humanitarianism toward African Americans, but was instead intended to offset the political advantages the slave states sought to attain by ways of such manipulations. In these early years of the United States, there was little consideration by Northern lawmakers to include Black people into that pledge of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. After much political infighting, an agreement was made and the 3/5 compromise was enacted. It involved counting 3/5 of a slave state's enslaved population toward the slave state's total population. Thusly, each enslaved person would be virtually 3/5 of a human being, or more precisely, 3/5 of a man. Women were not brought into the equation, as no woman of any racial background held a recognized status of citizenship in the United States. As the U.S. territories continued to grow, the 3/5 compromise would later lead to other comparable agreements, including the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the 1850 Compromise, and the highly impactful Kansas-Nebraska Compromise of 1854. With each state compromise, the primary point of contention was whether these U.S. territories that were seeking statehood would join the Union as a slave state or a free state. This free state versus slave state controversy greatly polarized the nation. The primary political parties in the country at that time were the Democratic Party and the Whig Party, as today's Republican Party had not yet been founded. This aggressive squabbling escalated throughout the nation, and in an effort to alleviate the conflict over the slavery issue, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Compromise was enacted, thus overturning the previous Missouri Compromise. Introduced by Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, the compromise was supposedly designed to ease the tensions regarding the slavery issue. However, the attempt failed miserably, and violence erupted in Kansas territory between pro- and anti-slavery activists, so much so that the territory was referred to as Bleeding Kansas. These brutal conflicts resulted in dozens of deaths on both sides of the dispute, and many historians viewed these hostilities as being a prelude to what would lead to the U.S. Civil War. The Kansas-Nebraska Compromise marked the virtual end of the Whig Party, as the pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions of the party parted ways. This void led to a new political party known as the Free Soil Party, which eventually transitioned into what we know today as the Republican Party. A few years later, in 1860, the presidential election was held, and this new party ran as its candidate an anti-slavery Republican from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Despite being excluded from the presidential ballot in 10 southern states, and although he received less than 40% of the overall vote, Lincoln defeated 3 other opponents and thus became the 16th president of the United States. The southern states were immediately outraged by the results of this election. They viewed Lincoln's presidency as being a threat to their system of institutionalized slavery, and they felt that Lincoln's administration would not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that required all escaped slaves upon capture to be returned to the enslaver, and that all officials and citizens of free states comply with this law. Just 1 month after the election, South Carolina seceded from the Union. It was followed by 6 other southern states, and in February of 1861, these 7 states founded what they deemed to be a new nation, the Confederate States of America. On April 12th, these Confederates attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Civil War began. 3 days later, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteer militia to crush this rebellion. This resulted in 4 more states seceded from the Union in July, bringing the total to 11 Confederate states. Now, despite what has been taught in U.S. public schools for over a century, Abraham Lincoln did not enter the Civil War in an effort to abolish slavery. This inaccurate perception lacks accuracy and context. In reality, Lincoln's primary objective for war was to preserve the Union. In his 1862 letter to newspaper publisher Horace Greeley, Lincoln stated, quote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving some others alone, I would also do that." Unquote. In his early debate with his presidential opponent, Stephen Douglas, Lincoln exclaimed, quote, "I will say that I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social or political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of making voters or jurors or Negroes, or qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, what I believe will forever forbid the two races from living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, and yet they still remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Unquote. Not exactly the words one would expect to be attributed to someone who is historically considered to be the great emancipator. Once again, contrary to common perception, the actions of the majority of the Northerners to abolish slavery was not motivated by humanitarian objectives, but were instead founded in efforts to achieve political and economic advantages. In an attempt to discourage other northern slave states from joining the Confederacy, on September 22nd of 1862, President Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. This document confirmed that all enslaved people held within slave states would officially be considered free in the eyes of the U.S. government. Although Lincoln's political stance was always anti-slavery, he was conflicted as to whether such an inflexible position on the issue would result in slave-holding northern states being coaxed to join the Confederacy in an effort to maintain their pro-slavery status. But after a Union military victory in the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln was confident that northern states would be far less likely to abandon the Union now that the war had turned in the Union's favor. And on January 1st of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted. Sisters and brothers, despite the idealized principles that this proclamation represents in U.S. history, the facts are that they did not emancipate or set free all enslaved people in the United States. That is a historical misrepresentation, far too often perpetuated in mainstream academia. The facts are that the Emancipation Proclamation only freed those enslaved African Americans held in Confederate states. Those who were enslaved in Union states remained in the status of slavery with no change to their political citizenship status following the emancipation. This is quite contrary to the historical perception attributed to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in most educational circles. Despite the shortcomings of the Emancipation Proclamation, it did serve as a precursor for the Senate's passing of the 13th Amendment in 1864 that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude throughout the United States. 2 months later, Lincoln signed the Enrollment Act, thus authorizing the drafting of Caucasian male citizens between the age of 20 and 45 into the Union military. This greatly bolstered the Union's armed forces and gave them a significant advantage over the Confederacy. Sisters and brothers, in spite the intentions of the Enrollment Act, any romanticized depiction of Northern troops majestically marching off to war for the purpose of abolishing slavery finds much of its foundation in fictional novels, Hollywood distortions, and academic misrepresentations. Factually speaking, intense animosity against the Civil War draft immediately erupted throughout the northern states. One of the points of contention involved the fact that anyone who could pay a $300 fee would be exempt from serving in the military. That is the equivalent to $7,500 in today's money. Poor white citizens could not afford to pay such an inordinate amount. This resulted in many people categorizing the war as being the rich man's war. Though systemic oppression was not as prevalent in these northern states, racist attitudes toward African Americans were nearly as prevalent amongst northern Caucasians as it was with their southern counterparts. Many prospective white draftees had no desire to risk their lives to free black people who lived hundreds of miles away in southern states. Skirmishes broke out in several cities and the tensions reached a breaking point in July of 1863 in, of all places, New York City. As the drafting process was proceeding, hundreds of angry protesters in Manhattan initiated a riot. Buildings were burned to the ground and property was destroyed as rioters overpowered the police. Hundreds of African American women and children were attacked and severely beaten. A black children's orphanage was burned to the ground, as were several black-owned homes and businesses. Caucasian people who were deemed to be sympathetic toward African Americans were also beaten and their property was destroyed. It took 3 days before the New York State militia intervened and ended the riots, but not before dozens of buildings were burned to the ground, hundreds of people had died, and thousands more were injured, the vast majority of whom were African Americans. At least 11 black men were lynched, with some of their bodies set on fire. So much for the romanticizing of Northerners going off to war. Eventually, the rioters were held off, cooler heads prevailed, and the draft resumed. The influx of new troops greatly contributed to the Union's war efforts, and the defeat of the Confederacy was imminent, as the Union was far more industrialized, better financed, and military equipped, as well as possessing more natural resources as did the southern states. As the year of 1864 came to a close, the Union military superiority began to dominate the battlefield. On April 9th of 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, and the American Civil War was over, with the victory going to the Union forces. 5 days later, President Abraham Lincoln would be shot by John Wilkes Booth. He would be pronounced dead a day later. Lincoln's death plunged the political atmosphere of the United States into utter chaos as the Reconstruction era had began, and instead of being led by Lincoln's forward-thinking administration, it would instead be led by his replacement, a bigoted Democrat from Tennessee named Andrew Johnson. The openly racist Johnson was sympathetic toward the Confederate cause as he himself was a former slave owner. As the new president, he almost immediately granted amnesty to most Confederate officers and permitted Southern states to elect state legislatures. This would lead to decades of disenfranchisement for Southern African Americans, who, in spite of having been emancipated, were now subjected to a new set of racist state laws that circumvented the federal statutes. Despite the fact that the Civil War had ended and the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery in the United States, the horrors of institutionalized racism and discrimination would continue to grow throughout the country. A new modernized form of bigotry and racism and oppression developed from state to state and would be so systemic it quickly became interwoven into the very fabric of American society. Sisters and brothers, this concludes part one of our three-part series, The Black Vote. How do we get here? We at Type Productions would like to thank you for taking the time to watch our video. If you enjoyed the content, please like, subscribe, and share with someone you may know or love. With that, I leave you with this. Sisters and brothers, I am aware that many do not value the study of history. To some, those are just events that happened a long time ago. However, I reiterate to you the words of the great Malcolm X, who stated, quote, "Of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research," unquote. If one truly seeks to understand the world as it is today, it is supremely advantageous to also seek a comprehension of the world as it was yesterday. For history is the very foundation of the present. Once again, sisters and brothers, I thank you for your time, and may peace be upon you and all of yours.
And I'm a historian, but I also realize the importance of community activism. For example, unlike some of my colleagues, I think it's very important that we go to the ballot box, that we sit on juries. I don't know if you can complain about police brutality or the political system if you're not willing to partake in it on some level or another. Whereas there are those of us who just completely dismiss that. So we must be activists, but we must also never lose sight of the importance of history.